In the uprising and the revolution of Karbala, there are a lot of different questions which people ask. One of these is, why did Imam Hussain alayhi salam take his family with him to Karbala? Some people ask this because they say that he knew that there was going to be a brutal battle which would take place between him and the army of Kufa, and that this battle would end with his martyrdom and with his family members being taken captive and being taken prisoner. They ask, why would Imam Hussain alayhi salam take the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam with him on this dangerous journey, knowing that he would be killed? Some people who do not understand the true Muhammadan revolutionary sacrificial concept of Islam will actually criticize the Imam for bringing his family with him. People who do not understand the concept of death will criticize Imam Hussain alayhi salam for this. And people who do not understand the concept of martyrdom for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fi sabilillah will also criticize Imam Hussain for taking his family with him. The question of why he actually did this in the first place and why he took his family with him, there have been different responses which people have provided for it, and there are different reasons why the Imam took his family. And inshallah I'll go through each one of these to try and find which one is actually correct. The first response, some people say, as to why Imam Hussain brought his family with him to Karbala, is because they say it was normal at the time. It was one of the normal customs and actions for the Arabs, that whenever they would go into battle, they would take their family members with them, and they would take their children and wives onto the battlefield. But this response which people give does not answer our question. It does not meet the needs of our question, because it brings other questions to our mind. The first thing we need to ask ourselves is why these Arabs back in those days used to take their families onto the battlefield. Even if it was true that it was the custom for these Arabs to bring family members onto the battlefield, what benefit and what gain would there be in bringing the family to the battlefield with him? The narrations that we have and the reasons that we have which explain why these Arabs would bring their family onto the battlefield was due to a very warped and twisted sense of honour which they had, in which case if they were killed or they were slain, then their family members should also be slain and killed with them, so that they would not have to survive on without the man of the family. Now this was clearly not the legacy that Imam Hussain alayhi salam sought when he brought his family and when he took his children and womenfolk onto the battlefield and towards the army of Yazid. Also, was it usual for Imam Hussain to copy the traditions and the customs of the Arabs, who for not long ago had been classed as the people of ignorance, people who were living in the days of Jahiliyyah? Would it be rational and sensible for us to think that the Imam would follow the traditions and customs of these people? No, it doesn't make sense to follow this line or this narrative. It also questions whether Imam Hussain was following the orders and the customs of the Arab people, or whether he was following the decree and the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when he brought his newborn children and his family to the battlefield. Another answer as to why he brought them, which is put forward by some people, and which is partially correct. There is some truth and there is some element of truth in the next response which people provide. And it is that the Imam knew that he bore a very great deal of responsibility and a divine mission on his shoulders, which was placed on him by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this mission was to try and bring about a social awareness in the society, and to bring consciousness and rationale and logic to the Ummah, to the Muslims. And he recognized that this mission would have to go through different stages in order for him to be able to fulfill this mission. He also recognized that one of these stages and one of the barriers and hurdles which he would have to overcome would be by fulfilling his martyrdom, by being martyred for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the battlefield, and also by showing the martyrdom of certain individuals which accompanied him to the battle. Meaning that once they died, And once people would see the sacrifice which they made through their martyrdom, people would become inspired. And people would learn lessons from their martyrdom and from when they were alive, showing the courage that they had by accompanying the Imam, even though he had very few followers at that stage. Another stage would then be completed after the martyrdom of Imam Hussain himself, and by all of his companions, one by one. As last night we mentioned Hur, tonight we will mention Habib ibn Mawahir. And one of these lessons was accomplished by means of speeches, an open and public display, speaking against the oppression and the tyranny which was imposed on the Imam by Yazid and by the government and the forces of Yazid. However, there is a second aspect to this response, and that is that Yazid wanted to secure his position by killing Imam Hussain, and then later claiming on that the reason why he had to kill the Imam was because the Imam had been following a warped version of Islam, and that he had strayed away from the true path, the true legacy of the Holy Prophet. Now, it was by means of the speeches which I just mentioned, by the captives of Karbala, led by Imam al-Sajjad, led by Zainab al-Kubra, that the oppression and the crimes of Yazid were exposed not only to the people who witnessed it, but when word spread and the entire Ummah became aware of what the reality of Yazid had done, and that anything which came out of his mouth or the mouth of his representatives was nothing but a blatant lie and propaganda. And it was because of these speeches and these open displays whereby people spoke up against tyranny and oppression that Yazid could not achieve his sinister and evil actions that he had set forth. It is because of these speeches that his plans were ruined and put to the side, and that the true path of Muhammadan Islam was kept alive until this day through the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. The Imam knew very well that if he and all of his children and his companions were killed, and some of his household members, some of the members of the Ahlul Bayt were not present to witness the tragedy, to witness the slaughter which had befallen them, then no one would be able to disclose with truth and with honesty the oppression which was committed against the family of the Holy Prophet. If there had been captives, if there had been relatives who were all slain and were all killed, and all of the 72 people and all of the members of the family were slain, then there would be no witness to testify to what had happened. The Imam realized this. He also realized that not everyone would be massacred, not everyone would be slain. There would be an opportunity for some people to carry on the message, to speak the haqq, and to continue on the teachings of the revolution of Ashura. The reality of taking his family with him was that so that some of them may be taken captive, and so that they could fulfill their own individual missions whilst they were in captivity and whilst they were being held as prisoners as well. There had to be some members of the family who would remain alive so that they could disclose this oppression. Otherwise, all of the blood that was shed in Karbala would have been in vain and would have been futile. And this is why the Imam brought the women of his household with him. And this is why it was considered to be a necessary action. And it can therefore be said that the public speeches which were given by Sayyidah Zainab, for example, shook the foundations of Yazid's government and eventually brought about its collapse with merely a few words. Now, I mentioned that this response is only partially correct. Now, although the answer is rational, although the answer makes sense, it doesn't meet the needs fully of the question which we asked, which is why did the Imam bring his family to Karbala with him? Because a second question still comes to mind. Why did the Imam bring the newborn children of his family with him? Why did he bring the babies of the Ahlul Bayt with him to the battlefield? The duty of exposing what happened in that day, the duty of exposing what happened in the month of Muharram on that sacred land, could have been left to be narrated, could could have been left to have been narrated by the elder members of the Ahlul Bayt, as was done by Imam al-Sajjad, as was done by Zainab al-Kubra, as were the other women who survived, who were in the caravan and the camp of Imam Hussain. There was no need, some people say, to bring these babies and to bring these newborn children to accomplish this duty of spreading the truth of Imam Hussain. Therefore, this argument does not fully explain the entire cause and the entire reason for bringing all of the members of the Imam's household with him, although we can understand that it is one of the philosophies behind the Imam bringing his family along. The third response which people give, sometimes while trying to provide a response to this question, they focused on the aspect of the human tragedy of this event, and they tried to emphasize that Imam Hussain intended to prove Yazid's inner self, to prove Yazid's intentions by showcasing the crimes which he committed against Islam, and by committing these crimes against the Ahlul Bayt themselves, the ones who were designated in the Holy Quran as being purified of all impurities. Some people argue that this is why the Imam brought all of the members of his household, including the women and the children. Even though he knew what Yazid would do to his family members, he brought them along in order to prove the true nature of Yazid and the system which he represented. And in this way, he could showcase that Yazid was not worthy of becoming the caliph or becoming the leader of the Muslim Ummah. And this response, which talks about a necessary sacrifice which had to be made by the Imam, is also cited as one of the reasons of why the Imam brought his household with him, but it still is not a complete answer. It only fits a small piece of the puzzle as to why the Imam did it. The fourth reason, others will come and will say that the reason for bringing the members of the household of Imam Hussain was that he wanted to try and incite and inspire people to come to his aid and to come and help him on the battlefield. Because when the Imam is seen with all of his children, with his newborn children, with innocent women who are not able to fight and defend themselves, his friends and his supporters would be persuaded to join him out of the mercy and out of the compassion of their hearts, and that the hearts of the enemies would become sympathetic. However, this possibility doesn't seem correct entirely either. Why? Firstly, the Imam could have tried to inspire and persuade his friends and enemies beforehand by making speeches, by sending representatives to different cities and different countries, explaining his mission, exposing the reality of Yazid. Secondly, the Imam did not want to create a state of anxiety and a state of fear in the Ummah. He learned this from his father, Amir al-Mu'mineen, when after the events of Saqifa, someone asked Amir al-Mu'mineen why he did not rise up and take the caliphate for himself. And one of the reasons for him not doing this was because he feared that the consequences would create such fitna amongst the Ummah that it would be worse for him to rise up and to take this opportunity to seize the caliphate than for him to sit and to have allowed it to take place. Imam Hussain did not want to rile up people's emotions and feelings and cause distress amongst the Ummah. And on the contrary, he wanted people to use their own logic and to use their own decision-making skills in order to choose the path which was right and to stand against the path which was wrong. Therefore, if we break down the real reasons, in which the Imam took his family before moving on to the last and most appropriate reason, we can see that some people have said that the Imam brought his family to Karbala such as by making a sacrifice to expose the intentions of Yazid. Some people said that it was so that he could bring witnesses to expose the crimes of the forces of Yazid, and so that his family would be able to tell the Ummah what had happened to him. But now I will explain the fifth reason, and this is the most correct reason. And although it may not seem as exciting as some people might think on the face of things, and it may not be as out there and exciting as a reason for the Imam bringing his family, we can't overlook the fact that this is the most truthful, the most likely, and the most logical reason. The real reason why Imam Hussain alayhi salam brought his family, brought his womenfolk, brought his newborn children to the battlefield is because he was worried about them. He was scared for them. He had anxiety in his heart over what would happen to them. If the Imam had gone to Karbala and left his family in Medina when he rose up against Yazid and when he made that journey to the land of al-Taf, there was fear that the evil forces which existed in Medina at the time would arrest and imprison the family members who had been left behind. The Imam sought in everyone's interest then to take his family members along with him so that on one hand he could keep them under his own protection, and on the other hand they could continue on the mission by lecturing and by speaking about the tragedy which had been faced by the Imam and by his relatives. And this is not just a theory which people have came up with, that the Imam was worried about his family being left behind. It can be confirmed through the narrations that we have. First of all, when we take the conduct of Yazid's government into consideration, it is probable that Yazid and his forces and his soldiers would have arrested and would have taken the members of the Ahlul Bayt left behind into custody. Secondly, on the night before the day of Ashura, Imam Hussain told all of his companions that they were free to leave him and that they were free to leave the land of Karbala, but he didn't give permission for his family members, the members of the Ahlul Bayt, to leave him and to go back to Medina or to go to any other city. He only granted this permission to the companions and to his friends. Thirdly, the governor of Medina at that time was Amr ibn Sa'id Ashdaq. And when the news of Imam Hussein's martyrdom reached this governor of Medina, he was rejoicing at this news. He was happy at the death of the Imam. At a time when all of Medina was engulfed in sorrow and in pain, and when they were mourning over the Imam's martyrdom, he came out and he said that this crying, this weeping, this azar, this mourning that you are doing should not be for Hussein, rather it should be for Uthman. In one of his other speeches, this governor begins to criticize the people who live in Medina at the time for mourning over Imam Hussein, and he rejoiced at the misfortune and the grief in which they were feeling. Now, if Imam had left the members of the Ahlul Bayt and the women in that society, in that country, in Medina at the time, can you imagine what this evil, vile governor would have done to them? Would he not have arrested them? Would he not have tortured them? Would he not have imprisoned them and done other countless evil actions towards them? This man, Sa'id, this governor, was the same one who gave the orders that all of the houses of Bani Hashim should be destroyed. And this is the same man who was stubborn through his early years in his hatred of Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. Now that we are in the month of Muharram and that we are halfway through the first 10 days, every single night we must not neglect to remember Aba Abdullah. We should remember how the Imam took his newborn children to the battlefield for them to receive arrows and to receive wounds to their bodies, because he knew that this sacrifice was one which he had to make. He knew that this sacrifice was one in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had bestowed upon him to complete. He knew that this was a necessary mission for him to undertake. And when we cry over what happened, we should never neglect the thought and the reasoning of why the Imam had to bring his family, the fear that the Imam had in his heart, the worry that he had to endure over what would happen to them. And may this serve as a lesson to connect even more with the story of the tragedy of Ashura, and to learn about the Imam himself further, and to learn about his thought processes, and to learn about his reasoning. And now if we look back to what happened 1300 years ago on the plains of Karbala, if we look onto the battlefield, day by day the scene begins to change. More and more soldiers from Yazid's army begin joining the camp. At this point, thousands upon thousands of people have come to kill Imam Hussain, the grandson of the Holy Prophet of Islam. Sayyidah Zainab says to her brother, Ya Akhu Ya Hussain, Thousands of soldiers are now gathering to fight you, and we have hardly 72 men who have stood with us. Do you not have anybody who can come to your help? That night, Imam Hussain alayhi salam writes a letter to his childhood friend Habib ibn Madahir, who was in Kufa. Kufa at this point was blocked off. Nobody was allowed to enter or to leave Kufa. And Habib did not know the whereabouts of Imam Hussain at this point until this letter from the Imam reaches him at his house. And at the time he receives this letter, he's having breakfast with his family. He's having breakfast with his wife and his newborn young son. Habib opens the letter and he reads the letter from Hussain. He kisses it and tears begin to flow from his eyes. His wife asks him what was wrong. Why is he crying? Habib says, I've received a letter from my master Hussain and he has asked me to join him in Karbala. Yazid's soldiers have surrounded him and are after his life. They are after his blood. They want to see him dead. Habib's wife says to him, Habib, your childhood friend has now called upon you. Your master now needs your help. So what are you waiting for? Go, Habib, before it's too late, before your master is slain. Habib reaches Karbala late in the evening, and Imam Hussain greets him with affection. Days and nights of Muharram begin to pass by, and Ashura eventually comes. At dawn, Ali al-Akbar gives the adhan for the last time. Yazid's soldiers blow the trumpet in order to start the aggression and to start the battle against al-Hussain. One by one the Sahaba, one by one the companions of the Imam go into the battlefield and give their lives bravely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Al-Hussain, Al-Abbas and Ali al-Akbar were busy from dawn until midday, collecting the bodies of the slain companions and the slain members of the household from the battlefield. And between Dhuhr and Asr time, Habib ibn Madahir comes to Imam Hussain alayhi salam, and he says, my master Hussain, allow me to go into this battlefield and to fight for you. Allow me to sacrifice my life for you and to sacrifice my life for the sake of Islam. Al-Hussain says, Habib, my childhood friend, stay with me because you give comfort to me. Habib accepts this and he doesn't go into the battlefield. And he stays with Imam Hussain so that he can comfort him, so that he can take care of his emotions. But Habib becomes restless and he persists and he asks the Imam, let me go and fight in the battlefield, let me be a shaheed for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in defense of you. And eventually Al-Hussain gives him permission. Hussain puts Habib onto the horse and Habib rides into the battlefield. And Habib fought bravely, but he was overpowered and he falls to the ground. And as he falls to the ground, one of the enemy soldiers comes and cuts off the head of Habib. All of the martyrs, all of the shuhada of Karbala had their heads cut off, but Habib's was the first head to be cut off from amongst the companions. And Habib's head was not hung on the spears, just like that of the other martyrs. Habib's head was tied to one of the horses, and it was pulled along the land of Karbala. Later on in Sham, Habib's head was tied to the neck of the horse. And there was a young boy called Qasim who followed the horse wherever it went. One day the man who was riding this horse with the head of Habib tied around it asked this young boy Qasim, why are you following me around everywhere I go? What is it that you want from me? Why do you follow this horse with this head of this man who has been slain? Why are you staring at the head of this man? This young boy Qasim looks at him and he says, this is the head of my father Habib ibn Madahir. Please give it to me so that I can bury the head of my father. I don't have the rest of his body, all I have is his head. Please let me bury this at least. At this moment in time, the cut off head of Habib looks at this young boy, looks at Qasim, and he says, my son Qasim, you are thinking about burying my head, but what about the head of Al-Hussain which rests upon the spear? To finish, I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant victory to the mu'mineen and the mu'mineen, And for all of the shuhada, please recite Surah Al-Fatiha after salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.